Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
The aftermath wasn't immediate chaos, as some might imagine. There was no screaming, no furious confrontation, no public breakdown that would have made it all easier to process. Instead, the baby shower disbanded slowly, like a storm had just passed, and everyone was too stunned to acknowledge what they had just witnessed. I imagined they filed out of the hall in clumps, whispering to each other in hushed tones, casting glances over their shoulders toward the dessert table where my laptop had sat like a detonated bomb. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I didn't need to. The work was already done. Danielle drove me home in silence for the first few minutes, her hands clenched around the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. She finally broke the silence with a question that sounded more like awe than concern. Do you think they'll ever recover from that? I looked out the window as the city passed us in soft golden streaks, the late afternoon sun sinking just low enough to cast long shadows over the sidewalks. My fingers gently rested on my stomach, feeling the slow, rhythmic kicks from within, a quiet reminder of what really mattered. I don't know, I said, but I didn't do it for them. When I got home, Greg was already waiting, parked in the driveway, his tie loosened, his hands trembling slightly, as he fumbled with his phone. He stood when I stepped out of the car, his eyes searching my face for any sign of what I might do next. I could see the panic behind his expression, the kind of fear that doesn't come from guilt, but from losing control. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and neither did I. We just stood there, two actors at the end of a play that had gone terribly off script. I didn't mean for it to happen like that, he finally said, his voice hoarse, as if the confession might somehow undo the damage. It was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless... Don't, I interrupted. Not with anger, but with exhaustion. Don't insult both of us by pretending it didn't mean something. He looked like he wanted to cry, but I didn't care. That part of me, the part that might have cracked at the sight of his pain, was gone. It had been carefully and methodically extracted, cut out with every night I had stayed awake, wondering why things felt off, with every glance he had shared with Claire that lingered a second too long, with every lie wrapped in affection. I want you to sleep in the guest room, I said calmly, my voice as still as water, and I want your things out by the end of the week. He opened his mouth, but I held up my hand. Don't say anything else. It's already done. That night, I lay in bed alone, not with sorrow, but with a strange sense of clarity. The house was quiet except for the creaks of settling wood and the distant hum of a neighbor's television. Greg stayed behind the closed door of the guest room, and I didn't care what he did in there. I had bigger things to focus on now. The baby shifted again, and I whispered a soft apology into the darkness, not for what I had done, but for the life I had almost given them. My child would grow up in a home without secrets poisoning the walls, without the heavy presence of betrayal lurking behind polite smiles. That I promised. Over the next few days, I moved through life like a ghost slipping through her old routine. People texted, some expressed shock, some offered pity, and a few, the brave or foolish ones, tried to get me to talk. Claire never called. She sent one message, a single line of hollow justification. It was a moment of weakness. I hope one day you can forgive me. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without replying. Forgiveness was not a currency I handed out like breath mints, especially not to someone who had never once, in our entire lives, understood the concept of loyalty without benefit. Greg, in an effort to appear repentant, offered to go to counseling, to explain, to take responsibility. But every word from his mouth felt like a performance for an audience he no longer understood. I told him I'd think about it, just to buy time, but my mind was already made up. I had an appointment scheduled with a family lawyer and another with a clinic for a paternity test. Not because I doubted who the father was, but because I needed to control every variable now. I was no longer interested in assumptions. The test came back 3 days later. The baby was Greg's. I let the paper sit on the table for hours before touching it. I read it once, folded it, and slid it into a drawer I rarely opened. That truth didn't change anything. It didn't erase the betrayal, didn't smooth over the cracks, didn't resurrect the life we had before. It only confirmed what I already knew. He would be part of this child's life, whether I wanted him to be or not. And then, as if timed by the universe for maximum cruelty, Claire posted a photo from Paris. She was smiling, standing on a balcony, a glass of wine in her hand, with the Eiffel Tower rising in the background like a monument to escape. The caption read, "New city, new beginnings, no regrets." Danielle saw it before I did and immediately called, fuming with rage. "Do you want me to send her something?" she asked. "I have a few ideas." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt so absurd. Claire always knew how to make an exit, even when she had to trample someone else to get out the door. "No," I said, "she's already running. That's all I need." But that wasn't entirely true. I sat down that night and wrote her a letter. No insults, no accusations, just one line scrawled in steady handwriting. "You lied with such ease that I almost admired you. But don't forget, I still have the second video. I didn't send it. I didn't need to. I took a photo of it, printed it, and folded it into a blank postcard addressed to her new apartment in Paris. I imagined her opening it, alone in some beautiful but unfamiliar space, reading those words in silence, feeling the chill crawl up her spine as she realized I was still capable of more. The second video, yes, the one from the hallway was just the beginning, had been recovered thanks to Danielle's ex-boyfriend, a cybersecurity tech who owed her more than a few favors. It showed Claire in the hotel room, laughing, taking a selfie with Greg, saying, "She's so tired all the time, she won't notice a thing." Her voice, her expression, the dismissiveness, it haunted me for days, but I never played it again. I kept the file hidden, encrypted, stored away like a loaded weapon I didn't plan to fire, not yet. A week later, I walked to the park near our house, the one I always imagined taking our child to once they were old enough to toddle around and climb things. I sat on a bench in the shade and watched the world move around me, parents pushing strollers, kids chasing bubbles, teenagers shouting into their phones. Life kept happening, it always does. I took out my phone, stared at the folder labeled Final, then deleted it without opening it. Not because I forgave her, not because I forgave him, but because revenge had already served its purpose. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. And sometimes it's the last word you never say, but they hear it anyway. Especially when you leave just enough space for them to wonder what you're still holding. Jason was the kind of person who never remembered to say thank you, because deep down, he'd been raised to believe the world owed him gratitude for simply existing. He was 2 years younger than me, but that gap had always felt much wider. Like I'd been born into responsibility, and he'd been born into applause. While I spent my teenage years folding laundry, cleaning bathrooms, and learning how to cook so we wouldn't eat takeout 5 nights a week, Jason was skipping class to play guitar in garages and getting grounded for crashing my dad's Lexus into a mailbox, only to be rewarded with a newer model by the end of the month. "He's just a kid," Dad would say. "Boys make mistakes." That was the phrase that carved itself into my memory, like graffiti on wet cement. By the time Jason turned 20, he had been fired from 3 jobs, dropped out of college twice, and was somehow still living in a downtown loft that my father paid for entirely. I, on the other hand, was juggling 2 part-time gigs and a full course load, relying on student loans and a work-study program to scrape together enough for textbooks and bus fare. When I asked my dad why Jason didn't need to contribute anything to his own life, he looked at me with the same patronizing tone he used when correcting a waitress. "He's trying to find himself, Aaron. He's figuring things out. Not everyone has your sense of direction." I remember feeling like someone had pulled the floor out from under me. That sentence echoed inside me every time I came home to find Jason lounging on the couch, shirtless, surrounded by pizza boxes, while I tried to study for finals with a migraine. Even after we both entered adulthood, nothing changed. I climbed my way up the corporate ladder through grit and caffeine, working 12-hour shifts and fighting to keep my head above water. Jason bounced between yoga retreats, failed side hustles, and brief stints as a consultant for companies Dad had some distant connection to. When he decided he wanted to get serious about real estate, Dad co-signed a loan for a new SUV and introduced him to a broker buddy who found him a beachfront condo within a week. No down payment required, just a signature and a handshake. I was sitting in a rheumatologist's office when I got the text from Jason. "Check out the view from my new place." I stared at the screen so long that the nurse had to call my name twice. It wasn't the condo that broke me, or even the sheer audacity of him bragging about it while I was calculating whether I could afford a single extra session of physical therapy that month. It was the knowledge that Dad had, once again, chosen to reward chaos while punishing consistency. I hadn't asked for much, just a little help, or at least some recognition that I was struggling through something real. Instead, I got a casual dismissal, as if my illness was a personal failure, a result of bad planning or not drinking enough kale smoothies. He said, "Maybe you should think about changing your lifestyle," as if a decade of working myself into the ground was something I could undo with a gym membership and a green juice. I never told Jason I was sick. I doubt he would have noticed if I had. We hadn't spoken in over a year by then, not since the Christmas dinner where he showed up 2 hours late, drunk, and made a speech about how hard it is being a free spirit in a world that demands structure. I excused myself halfway through the meal, claiming a headache, and haven't seen him in person since. He still texts occasionally, always something meaningless, links to music, pictures from the beach, a meme that made him think of me, usually something involving cats. Not once did he ask how I was doing or if I needed anything. And honestly, that was fine with me. The less he knew, the better. Because here's the thing about people like Jason. They live in a world where consequences only happen to other people. They float above problems, and when they do fall, someone like Doug is always waiting to catch them with a checkbook and a condescending smile. That's why what I did next wasn't petty. It wasn't about revenge. At least not in the way most people understand it. It was about balance. About setting the scales right after a lifetime of watching one side sink deeper and deeper into the mud, while the other just hovered in the air untouched. I thought about it for days before I made the call to the hospital billing office. I asked them to resend the financial responsibility form. They said, "Sure, no problem." I waited for it to come in the mail like someone waiting for a jury verdict. When it arrived, I filled it out in silence at my kitchen table. I listed my father's full name, his address, his phone number, and signed it with the most careful, steady handwriting I could manage. No mistakes, no doubt. And you know what? It felt good. Not triumphant, not giddy, just good. Like stretching a sore muscle or finally sleeping after a week of insomnia. I wasn't trying to ruin anyone's life. I was just tired of pretending mine didn't matter. I placed the form back into the envelope, sealed it, and dropped it off at the mailbox on the corner. No drama, no announcement. Just another letter in the pile of mail my father probably tossed onto his expensive kitchen counter without reading. And somewhere, Jason was probably sipping beer on a balcony, watching the waves roll in, completely unaware that the tide was about to turn. The day the paperwork arrived for the second time, folded neatly in the hospital's stiff white envelope, I sat at my small kitchen table and stared at it as though it might unfold itself and leap at me, demanding some kind of reaction to Mahop I didn't feel ready to give. It was a cloudy Tuesday afternoon, one of those dull gray days where the air felt still and humid without actually being warm. And the apartment was quiet in that lonely way that doesn't come from silence, but from absence. No music, no texts, no calls, just the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional passing car 3 floors down. There was something about the way the envelope sat on the table, stark against the chipped wood surface, that made it feel more personal than it probably should have. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't urgent, but it was heavy with the kind of weight that builds up slowly, like a pressure in your chest that doesn't hurt until you try to breathe deeply. I didn't open it right away. I made myself a cup of tea first, though I knew I wouldn't drink it. It was more about the process, the ritual, something to do with my hands, to make the next part feel less deliberate. I chose a chipped ceramic mug I'd bought from a street vendor years ago during a work trip to Seattle, back when I still had a job, and back when things like work trips felt exciting instead of exhausting. The mug had a crack running down the side that never quite leaked, but always threatened to, which felt metaphorically appropriate. I poured the water, dropped in a bag of some herbal nonsense meant to reduce inflammation, and set it down next to the envelope before finally sitting back down. The first time I filled out this form, I'd done it in the clinic under fluorescent lights with my hands trembling from fatigue, my skin cold with that dry hospital chill that never seems to go away. This time, I was in my own space, in my own time, and the decision felt like mine. No nurses, no questions, just me, a pen, and a quiet kind of fury that had been growing in me for years. I didn't hate my father. I don't think I ever could, because hate requires energy and investment, and I had run out of both a long time ago. What I felt now was more like the opposite of love. Not indifference exactly, but detachment, as though some invisible thread between us had finally frayed enough to snap. I unfolded the form, read it carefully, and began to fill it out again. Full legal name, Douglas William Palmer. Relationship, father, emergency contact, same. Financial responsibility, yes. Signature required. I signed it in smooth, even strokes, pressing the pen just a little harder than necessary. Not hard enough to tear the paper, but enough to leave an impression. I stared at the ink for a moment after I was done, half expecting it to smudge or blur, but it remained crisp and permanent. There was something strangely liberating about writing his name there, something final and clean, like setting down a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for too long. I didn't feel guilt, and I didn't second-guess myself. In fact, for the first time in months, I felt like I was making a decision that wasn't about survival or appeasement or politeness. It was about reclaiming something I'd been denied over and over again: the right to be seen, to be heard, and to matter. Later that evening, Mara stopped by to drop off groceries, a routine she insisted on keeping, even though I told her a dozen times she didn't have to. She noticed the form sitting near the edge of the table, the envelope addressed and sealed but not yet mailed, and raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" she asked. Not accusing, just curious in that way close friends are when they sense something has shifted. I told her it was just hospital paperwork, which was technically true, and then I added, I decided to list my dad as the payer. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at me for a long moment, the way someone does when they're not sure if you're joking, or maybe hoping you are. "You serious?" she finally asked, and I nodded. "He said it was my lifestyle that caused all this," I reminded her, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "So I figured he can help pay for it." She didn't laugh, but the corner of her mouth twitched. "You know he's going to flip," she said, and I nodded again, this time with the slightest smile. "Good," I replied, and we let the moment settle. She didn't press me on it, didn't scold or suggest I reconsider. She just sat across from me and started unpacking the groceries, like we were two women living in a different kind of normal, one where things made sense and bills were paid by people who actually caused the damage. I dropped the envelope into the mailbox the next morning, just after sunrise, the sky still streaked with that early pink that always made me feel like something new might be possible. I didn't hesitate. I didn't look back. I walked home with my hands in my pockets and my spine straighter than it had been in weeks, maybe months. My body still hurt and my muscles still ached, but inside I felt steadier, like the ground beneath me had stopped shifting for just a second. That weekend, Jason posted a photo of a charcuterie board on the deck of his condo, captioned, "Living the dream, grateful every day." I didn't comment, I didn't text, I just looked at the image for a moment, then closed the app, turned off my phone, and pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. The dream he was living had always been paid for, with someone else's sleepless nights. And now, for once, the invoice was going exactly where it belonged. The call came at 9:21 in the morning on a Wednesday that had started like any other. uneventful, slow, tinged with the background ache that had become the default setting for my body. I had been lying in bed with a heating pad draped across my lower back, watching condensation trail down the bedroom window as a summer storm gathered in the sky. There was something unusually calm about that morning, the kind of eerie calm that always seems to arrive just before something irreversible happens. And I remember thinking that I should probably try to get up and at least move to the couch before my joints stiffened up for the rest of the day. But then the phone rang, and everything shifted. It wasn't my phone. I didn't hear the ring, but I imagined it clearly, sharp, shrill, maybe even a little too loud, in the kind of home where no one expects bad news. It would have been a landline, because Doug still insisted on keeping one, convinced that cell phones were unreliable in a real emergency, which was funny, given how unreliable he had been in every emergency I ever lived through. He would have been in his kitchen, probably drinking his first cup of coffee, maybe looking out the window at the neat hedges the gardener trimmed every Thursday. Maybe Jason was on speakerphone again, talking about the Condo Association or his new blender, the kind that costs more than a month of my medication. I imagined my father pausing, the phone against his ear, his forehead wrinkling slightly as the woman from the hospital explained that his daughter had been admitted through emergency, that her condition had rapidly declined, and that, according to the paperwork, he was both her emergency contact and her listed financial guarantor. I like to think he felt a twinge of confusion at first, maybe even disbelief, like this couldn't possibly be real, because I had never made demands, never caused scenes, never asked him to carry any of my weight. I had always been the quiet one, the one who didn't interrupt, the one who never needed bailing out of anything. And now here I was on a gurney, unconscious, with a file full of signatures that all pointed straight back to him. The night before, my body had simply given out. There wasn't a dramatic moment, no gasp or fall or tragic music playing in the background. It had been slow and creeping, like fog rolling in over the edges of my skin. I had tried to make a cup of tea because something in my chest had felt tight and fluttery, like a bird was trapped under my ribs. My vision blurred when I reached for the kettle, and I remembered placing one hand on the counter to steady myself. The next thing I knew, I was on the floor, and everything was sideways. The cabinets, the tiles, the shadows on the wall. The paramedics said I was lucky my phone had landed close enough to trigger the emergency call function. They said it like it was a blessing, but it felt more like a compromise between fate and exhaustion. When I came to, I was already in the hospital, a needle in my arm, monitors beeping softly around me. No one had arrived to sit by my bed, which I expected. No Mara, because she hadn't been listed this time. No Jason, because he wouldn't have known. And certainly not Doug, not yet. But I knew the process had started. The system was now following the instructions I had signed in black ink, and all roads led back to the man who once told me to take better care of myself, as if illness was a form of laziness. Later that afternoon, while I sipped ginger ale from a plastic cup and pretended to read a pamphlet about managing flare-ups, a nurse walked in with a clipboard and said, almost offhandedly, "Your father called. He had some questions about the billing. We told him we'd have someone follow up tomorrow." She didn't linger. She didn't ask anything. She just updated a chart and left. But I sat there for a long time afterward, holding that cup, thinking about how that moment, brief, sterile, bureaucratic, carried more weight than all the birthday cards I'd ever received from him combined. At some point, Doug must have called Jason because 2 hours later, I got a text from a number I hadn't seen in months. It was short, almost too short to believe it was from someone who once lived in the same house as me. "What the hell is going on?" That was it. No, "Are you okay?" No, "Do you need anything?" Just confusion and accusation rolled into one cheap sentence. I didn't answer. I stared at the screen until the light dimmed and the message disappeared into the lock screen. Then I put the phone face down on the bedside table and turned toward the window. The clouds had started to clear, and a streak of sun broke through the blinds, landing right across the white blanket that covered my legs. The warmth was brief but grounding, a reminder that time was moving forward, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Somewhere in another part of the city, my father was likely sitting with a stack of documents, listening to some calm-voiced billing coordinator explain copays and coverage limits and deductible tiers. Somewhere on the coast, Jason might have been pacing across his deck, phone to his ear, wondering how the hell his sister had managed to pull him into a storm that wasn't supposed to be his to weather. But it was never about the storm. It was about the fact that for once, they couldn't ignore it. They couldn't laugh it off, couldn't shift the blame, couldn't throw money in a direction they chose to soften the consequences of someone else's recklessness. This time, the reckoning was wrapped in paperwork, legally binding, emotionless, and slow burning. This time, they were going to feel the weight of my silence. As the sun disappeared behind the clouds again, and the hallway outside my door echoed with the sounds of cartwheels and soft shoes, I let myself drift, not quite asleep, not quite awake, but somewhere in between, where regret doesn't reach and second-guessing has no voice. I didn't know what would happen next, whether Doug would try to fight it, or whether Jason would start pointing fingers and pretending he didn't know me. But I knew that whatever happened, I had already done the only thing I needed to do. I had spoken in the only language they respected, obligation. I had handed them the kind of responsibility they never expected from me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt, in some strange and distant way, whole. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, the air had turned heavy with early summer heat, that sticky kind of warmth that clings to your skin and makes every movement feel slower, more deliberate, like the world is forcing you to pay attention. Mara arrived just before noon, exactly when she said she would. Her hatchback parked crooked along the loading zone, hazard lights blinking and a paper cup of iced coffee sweating in the center console. She greeted me with her usual sarcasm and a tight hug that smelled faintly of lavender and dry shampoo, and I remember thinking that it was strange how comfort doesn't always come from the people who are supposed to offer it, but from the ones who simply show up again and again without needing a reason. I didn't speak much during the drive home. The hospital had sent me off with 2 new prescriptions, a caution about exertion, and a manila envelope thick with lab results and aftercare instructions that I had no intention of reading until I absolutely had to. I sat in the passenger seat with the window halfway down, letting the wind press against my face while Mara hummed along to the radio. We passed a billboard advertising a new luxury apartment complex, with perfect white teeth smiling back at us and a slogan that read, "Live effortlessly," which felt like a cruel joke after the week I had just survived. I wanted to laugh, but my body hurt too much, and my mind was too tired to summon the energy for anything beyond a deep, quiet exhale. When we pulled up to my building, Mara insisted on walking me up the stairs, even though I told her I could manage. She carried my bag, ignored my protests, and waited until I unlocked the door before nudging me inside like some stern but loving nursemaid. The apartment was just as I'd left it, dim and still, the dishes from my last meal before the collapse still sitting in the sink, a blanket crumpled on the couch, a paperback novel lying face down on the armrest, as if abandoned mid-thought. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something else, something stale and unidentifiable, like time had moved differently in my absence. Mara helped me to the couch, adjusted the pillows without asking, and placed the remote, my phone, and a bottle of water within reach like it was a ritual she'd performed 100 times. She didn't stay long. She said she had errands to run, promised to come back the next day, and told me not to get up unless something was on fire. I smiled and nodded, but inside something was unraveling, something small and silent that had nothing to do with pain or illness. It was the realization that the worst part of all of this wasn't the hospital stay, or the paperwork, or even the bills. It was the certainty that the people who should have called, should have visited, should have cared, never did. A few hours later, as I sat cross-legged on the couch flipping through the discharge notes, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number, but I recognized the clipped phrasing immediately. "Hospital bill came through. You should have told me." There was no name, No question about my health, no apology, just that single sentence. Sharp and cold and utterly typical. I stared at it for a long time, then locked the screen and placed the phone face down again. A moment later, a soft knock at the door startled me. No one ever knocks anymore. But it was only the mailman, dropping a few envelopes into the box outside my apartment. I shuffled over slowly, limbs stiff, and retrieved them without thinking. One envelope stood out from the rest. It was thick, cream-colored, and addressed in familiar handwriting that made my stomach twist. I opened it carefully, knowing full well what it would contain. And sure enough, in one was a printed hospital receipt, paid in full, with a note written on a small note card, folded in half. The handwriting was my father's. It read, simply, "You didn't have to do this." There was no warmth in the words, no regret, no curiosity or attempt at connection. Just a flat, factual observation, like he had finally acknowledged my existence, but only in the context of financial inconvenience. I held the card for a moment, then tore it down the center, not out of anger, but because I didn't want to give it the permanence of being whole. I dropped it into the trash can beside the kitchen counter, the same one where bills had piled up for months, unpaid and unanswered. That card would be no different. Over the next week, I received 2 more messages from Jason. One asked if we could talk. The other simply read, "Why would you do that to him?" I never responded. I didn't need to. There was nothing to explain. They both knew why, even if they refused to admit it. They knew because they had built an entire family dynamic around the assumption that I would absorb the damage quietly and disappear into the background. And the moment I stepped out of that role, even slightly, their entire foundation cracked. I didn't want revenge. That was never the point. What I wanted was something far more subtle, far more lasting. I wanted them to feel the weight of being needed in a way that could not be ignored or pushed onto someone else. I wanted them to realize that the daughter and sister they had dismissed as fine on her own had the power to shake the ground they walked on, not by screaming or fighting or making scenes, but by doing the one thing they never expected me to do: demand something without asking, without apology, and without fear. There's a strange peace in letting go of the idea that things will ever be fair. Fairness is a myth we cling to when we're young, a kind of moral bedtime story meant to soothe us into believing that the world operates according to logic and kindness. But the truth is, sometimes you just survive. Sometimes you draw lines not because you want to hurt someone, but because you finally accepted that they were never going to protect you, no matter how loudly or quietly you suffered. On the first night back in my apartment, I opened my journal and wrote one line in the center of the page. Sometimes, silence says it all. I stared at the ink until it dried, closed the cover, and placed it beside my bed. I didn't know what would happen next, and I didn't care. The story wasn't over, but my part in their story was finished. I had rewritten my ending with a form, a signature, and a silence they would never forget. And that, more than anything else, was enough.